Hey, hello and welcome. Welcome back to Deep Noetics, episode 4. And today we're going to stray a bit from the regular topic of looking at political economic systems of power and go and do a bit of a deep dive into the unconscious. Now, before we begin, I'd like to encourage you to subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment with any questions, any suggestions for further videos. Also, if you're interested, sign up for my courses. I did a course last year on the philosophy of the machine, philosophy of technology. That course is still available. You can sign up, link is in the description. And furthermore, I'm going to be teaching a course on the topic of power in summer. And if you don't want to miss it, if you want to be in the loop about it, then you can click on the link in the description and register to be informed about when the course is up. Alternatively, you have the QR code right here. Just scan it and you will be directed to the page, to the landing page of the power course. Now that we got that out of the way, I'd like to tell you what we were speaking about today. First of all, I want to introduce you to the basic concepts of depth psychology, of psychoanalysis, of the deep structure of the unconscious. We begin with this in order to get a general overview of the framework that we're dealing with. And then I will explain to you how that ties into the notion of power, how that specifically also ties into the notion of propaganda as devised by Edward Bernays, and how we are controlled by impact on our deeper impulses, impact on our deep recesses of the unconscious. Once again, like, subscribe, and sign up for my course if you're interested, and let's begin. So, what is the unconscious? I'd like to share an image here, namely from the artist Peter Birkhäuser, who was an artist but also a patient of the analytic psychologist Carl Gustav Jung. You can see here an image titled Imp Prison Power from 1958. There seems to be a kind of animal, a kind of beast that is buried and embedded within a mountain, a rock that is also shaped like a brain, like a human brain. It is a huge mountain, as you can see a little car here at the bottom. And you can read the description here. This is on the website of Eternalized. I can recommend this page. The fiery creative power of nature lies within the depths of a mountain. The animal that is imprisoned is a content of the unconscious, exerting a strong pressure. It is something in the soul, perhaps also in the body, which could provoke an explosion. Inadequate emotional outbursts often characterize such a situation. Flames shoot out and stones thunder down. It could erupt and destroy everything anytime. At the bottom, a man leaves his car and runs away in terror. The round golden eye of the animal is like a seed of light in the darkness. For the creative powers also possess the possibility of insight and consciousness. Like the eye of a bird, it focuses on the far rather than the near. The animal is a sort of behemoth, the dark female side of God, waiting to be liberated from its prison in the depths of the earth. So there's a lot to unpack here. Speaks of the dark female element of God. There seems to be a repressed element that Jung speaks about, and that is that of the material and the maternal, or also the feminine. We will be discussing the feminine to some extent today as well. There is a deeper work, if you want to go really deep in the studies of this, called The Great Mother by Erich Neumann. that I can recommend if you're interested in researching this topic further. So let's take the Trinity. Jung always spoke of a lacking fourth element, a departing fourth whenever you have a trinity. So the quaternio, the constellation of 4, is the most complete, the most holistic, you could say. My very first video on this channel actually deals with the quaternity. If you're interested, you should check it out. And what happens in a lot of his therapeutic practices is that there is a constellation of 3 in the dreams of some of his patients that is completed to a constellation of 4 once a certain insight is reached, once a certain level of healing has been reached. And if we take the Holy Trinity, for example, in Christianity, there is a 4th element that is silent, or a 4th element that is not always explicitly named, and that is an element that is at once material, as you've got the Spirit, the Father, the Son, and it is also feminine. It is material, feminine. In some respects, it is evil, it is dark, it is unknown. So what is depicted here in this image as well is this beast that is lingering within the unconscious, but that is massively, massively bigger than the human here. In the same sense, the unconscious can be understood in such a way that it represents a much larger part of the self than the ego, than what we can rationally or what we can consciously understand about ourselves. There are forces much deeper than this, something that Nietzsche already picked up. Arguably, this is where the Jungian conception originates from, namely the notion of the self in the chapter on the despisers of the body in Thus Spake Zarathustra. Excuse me, my sound setup just crashed. So, in Thus Spake Zarathustra, Zarathustra speaks of the despisers of the body. Now, who are they? He specifically refers to Christians and sects of a similar sort that deny the bodily world, the sensation and pleasure of the physical world, and consider it sinful, degenerate, evil, and retreat into a purely spiritual realm. Now that is considered a lie by Nietzsche, as the self is the body, and the self is a soul much larger, a force much larger than the spirit, than the ego. And it is the true master in many respects. The ego is just what rationalizes the deeper contents of the self. And if you go deeper into philosophical underpinnings of the Jungian notions of the unconscious, you arrive at the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer, in which he makes a similar account as the Hindu Upanishads, namely that there is such a thing as the large soul and the small soul. There's such a thing as the will and the representation. And the accurate part here is that term Vorstellung in German, representation, as it is an image of the will. It is a small, it cannot capture the entire will. The entire will is ungraspable, but there is a representation, a kind of sub-will that represents the will as such. And that is what is happening with the ego. The ego is an idol we create of the self that is necessary for us to realize our own existence. So to understand, to be conscious, to know oneself, one has to have an image of the self that image is never the true self. It is always a reduction or distortion, and that is what we refer to as the ego. And that ego can be overwhelmed by much stronger, much larger unconscious forces. For example, during the Nazi dictatorship in Germany, Jung would characterize the forces that were unleashed as the ancient Germanic god Wotan running wild, running rampant. And that Wotan was kind of an archetypal entity in the unconscious of the people, and that he was unleashed and it overcame the people where they were no longer capable of individually resisting that force that was unleashed in the unconscious. So I just mentioned the term archetype. So the archetypes are the internal structure of the unconscious. It is what structures the self to have a coherent setup of parts. So you could understand it as the unconscious or the self decomposing into different archetypes that allow us to flourish and live in the world. So in a sense, the ego is a kind of archetype which gives rise to another one called the shadow. In a sense, if the ego distorts the self, which it always needs to do as you cannot fully grasp the self, there is a content of the self that remains unrepresented, that remains thus repressed, denied, or merely overlooked. And that kind of aspect of the ego, just as a shadow that it casts, it reifies itself in the shadow. It comes into being in the form of the shadow, in the form of the internal adversary that is part of the self. It doesn't necessarily have to be evil. It is just a counter image that is created by itself if there is an ego. And you could see that as like a vertical axis of the ego and then the shadow at the bottom, which is then supplied with a horizontal axis of the Anima and the Animus. The Anima and the Animus, they are the masculine and the feminine soul. They are two complementary spirits within the unconscious. They're fundamental archetypes of the two genders. So, for example, just to skip ahead a little bit, you get the notions of the anima. For example, here, the anima, the female soul of a man, is also his fate, an eternal pattern that is mirrored in every mother, wife, and lover. In the picture, she looks towards the left, towards the unconscious, and her hair, involuntary thoughts, have the green color of vegetation. They form a bed in which her man can rest. The anima is a core concept in Jungian psychology. A positive anima integration opens the way into more profound inner depths, symbolizing man's potential for creativity. Because she is his greatest danger, she demands from man his greatest, and if he has it within him, she will receive it. Okay, so we have two important things to note here. First of all, the feminine is neither positive nor negative. It carries the potential to be both. There is a benevolent anima and there is a horrible, an evil feminine aspect. And it says here that it is the greatest danger because the anima can have a pull, a draw towards herself that a masculine soul can very hardly resist. And that pull is not always one towards the good or a better place. We know the famous myth of the sirens that Odysseus encountered. He was traveling during the Odyssey and was heard about the legend of the sirens that would woo men with their beautiful appearance and their beautiful songs, and they would fall into the water and then be devoured and drowned by the sirens. And Odysseus, a brave hero as he is, he wanted to witness it for himself, and so he had his men tie him to the mast of the ship so he could witness the song, and he would not let his men untie him under no circumstances, though he did desperately call for them to untie him when he heard their songs, and that way he survived because his men followed his orders and did not let him go to the sirens. They kept him tied to the mast of the ship. And this is one of the stories of the horrible Anima, with this ultimate pull it has. But there are positive examples as well. Odysseus also encounters Athena, which is a common theme among many Greek myths. The encounter with Athena, which is a goddess of wisdom. It is Sophia. Wisdom. You got Eve in Genesis of the Old Testament. You get a positive anima alike, and that can convey a kind of homeliness, a kind of safety in the world. And that is what the soul is desiring. That is what pulls the ego towards an anima, and it exhibits the greatest danger because you have all sorts of perils. In for example, the mother, the tyrannical mother, the negative version of the mother archetype in the feminine soul, is one that wants to prevent the individuation, the development of the ego, development of consciousness, and wants the ego to remain its child, and thus it desires to drown the ego, to drown it in the unconscious, to not let the individuum, the individual develop and mature and become an adult. Conversely, you also have the Animus, which is the masculine soul, which is essentially the counterpart to this, with obviously different properties, different essential qualities. And the thing to keep in mind about the archetypes is that, first of all, they're not exhaustive. These are not metaphysical categories. You do not list all of them somewhere. They are basically principles that the self decomposes into in attempts to make parts of the self conscious and bring parts of the self to the surface level. So the self cannot directly be fully observed, but it can show itself in its multiple faces, which are not clearly delineated and which are not fully exhausted by a particular list. But one way of looking at it is this distinction into ego and shadow, the part of the conscious self and the part of the unconscious self, or the distinction between ego shadow and then the horizontal axis of the anima and the animus. So that is one way of understanding it. The second thing to understand is that the archetypes are not necessarily purely mental. The mental plane is often conceptualized as something that is conscious, something that we reflect upon in the given moment. However, this mental plane arises together with the physical plane from a common core, a monism that is to some extent essentially mysterious. That notion, in a more rigorous academic fashion, has been called dual aspect monism. I can recommend the works of Harold Atmanspacher. This is a very niche knowledge to look deeper into the philosophical underpinnings of this. What I'm getting at essentially is that the mental and the physical, the material and the spiritual world, are two aspects of a fundamental underlying unity, And the archetypes lie in that fundamental unity. They're not purely mental, and of course they're not purely physical either. You get physical instantiations, such as patterns of behavior, relationships between men and women, or particular idols. You get these patterns of female goddess statues, female nature cults, in the case of the archetype of the Great Mother. But they're also mental. You also get these representations in dreams. You also get these appearances of archetypal characters, archetypal figures in dream landscapes, in your own dream scenarios. But the domain that the archetypes fundamentally reside in is the unity of the physical and the mental. The self is not purely one or the other. The self arises from the unity that is neither physical nor mental. And so the archetypes, they do both. We cannot, there is no world without Dasein, as Heidegger puts it. There is no world without being in the world, without some form of openness of the world to a conscious observer. And therefore, we cannot think the world as purely physical. A purely physical world would have no properties. It would have no color, it would have no sound, it would have no flavor, it would have no size, no scale. Even this vast infinity of the universe is something that encounters us because of our scale that our mental perception relates it to. We relate to our world, to our conscious world we observe, and in relation to that, the expanse, the vast expanse of the universe, we encounter as gigantic, as something beyond. At the same time, we cannot imagine something purely mental either. If there was no world, there never has been a world, what would the mental plane think about? Would it think itself? How would it even understand any self if there was nothing to reflect on? Like a self needs to bounce off of the world, so to say, to understand itself in respect to the other. And if there's no other, where would that self arise from? So the physical and the mental, they both arise in a sense simultaneously, synchronistically, from a common core, from a common monism and a kind of mysterious unity. That is something that Jung often spoke about. Jung referred to it as the mysterium conjunctionis, the mysterious conjunction of the two aspects. That was an important part of medieval alchemy to look at. And the synchronicity, that is the meaningful coincidence of the mental and the physical. Not a causal relationship, but a meaningful coincidence. For example, you think of something and it suddenly appears in the world, or you dream of something and something that you dreamt of happens the next day. This is a meaningful coincidence. This is what binds, this is the relationship, what that binds the mental and the physical. There's a meaningful relationship between the mental and the physical. Whilst the physical itself is causally closed, or can be assumed to be causally closed, there's obviously disagreements about it, but there are certain causal properties, causal structures, certain physical laws that happen in the physical world, and they do not apply necessarily to the mental world, but the mental world is not separate from the physical world. They are related to each other, and the character of that relationship is synchronicity. It is the meaningful coincidence of mind and matter. And so the archetypes, they give rise to both. The world itself can only be recognized when certain archetypes of ourself are in place. When we have a certain archetypal structure to our perceptual framework. And that is, in a sense, depth psychological extension of the Kantian argument of transcendental idealism. So, just to recap, Kant assumed that he assumed that the physical world was necessary for any kind of philosophy, for any kind of truth. You always had to make recourse to the physical world, to the world of perception, world of phenomena. However, this world of phenomena could not be perceived if there wasn't a certain a priori, that means already given structure of your consciousness that allowed you to perceive the world. And this structure already assumed or already pre-configured your perception in a certain way. So he, in the case of natural sciences, spoke mainly of time, space, and causality. So the principles of time, space, and causality had to be already pre-given in order to perceive anything. In some sense, time, space, and causality are archetypes of pure perception. Now, what happened with that conception is that with the development of physics, certain assumptions about it had to be dropped. That wasn't necessarily inevitable, but as an example, Kant spoke of time and space as being Euclidean, which means flat. It's like an empty box, infinite box of time and space in which the universe kind of is situated and takes place. And that notion is known mathematically as Euclidean space, and the mathematical conceptualization of that coordinate system is called the Cartesian coordinates. However, when Newtonian mechanics was replaced by general relativity in modern physics, or in classical physics rather, you had a change in the assumption about space. The Euclidean space was no longer assumed because you did not need to assume all of the axioms, all of the preconditions necessary to conceptualize a flat space, but you could also have curved spacetimes, which was first developed by Bernard Riemann, by assuming that you do not actually need to have a parallel axiom that assumes that two parallel lines never meet unless in infinity. Once you drop that, and you can have so-called spacetime manifolds, like spheres, the surfaces of spheres, then you didn't really need to assume a flat space. You didn't really need to assume this flat box, this empty infinite receptacle in which the universe is situated, but the universe itself distorts space and time. The universe itself is a distorted space-time. In a sense, this can be interpreted as Kant being wrong about the notions of time and space, but you could also give him the benefit of the doubt and say that math and theoretical physics just wasn't that far yet at his time, and you can still go with the Kantian assumption that space and time are archetypes of perception, just that these archetypes of perception are better described as Riemannian spacetime rather than Euclidean spacetime. So this is going very much into detail, but and another way to understand this, just looping it back to the importance of archetypes in science, in understanding the world, is to say that the notions of space and time, the fundamental archetypes that allow us to understand the physical world, are living entities. They are living entities. They are physical in the sense that they grow with us. They grow with our encounter of the world. And so the notions of space and time are not being just mechanically replaced, but they're actually growing. They're actually growing, developing. They're growing with our self, with our cognitive structure, with our scientific conception of the world. And this is where it becomes relevant. Actually, the psychoanalytic aspect, the study of the mind, becomes highly relevant for the study of the physical world. And this is very much understood when looking at modern physics, when looking at the rise of quantum mechanics and how to interpret what it means that an observation alters the result of the observation itself alters the result of an experiment, of a measurement. That means the observer plays an active, not a passive role in the creation, in the manifestation of our physical world. And this is exactly where we can understand that these archetypes are not situated in the purely mental. They're not situated in the purely physical. They are arising out of this mutual interplay, this mutually reinforcing growth and development of life in a process of making more of the world conscious by also making our notion of space and time more conscious. So, how does that relate now to power? How does this relate to our power that arises from our depths? And it ties into this through the resonances with the archetypes. So the archetypes as something that we cannot get rid of, something that is inherent to our psyche, they can be stimulated, they can be targeted by invoking a certain resonance between some external impulse and an activation of the internal reaction, of the internal energies, potentialities, potencies of the unconscious. This sounds a bit abstract, but you can say, for example, in the early days of propaganda and public relations, the application of desire-evoking images in advertising, for example, red lips, for example, kind of erotically stimulating imagery, or at least hinting at it, would unconsciously stimulate an eros. It would unconsciously stimulate a kind of erotic or romantic anima activation that is used for manipulation. It is used to manipulate the citizen, the average consumer, to purchase a product. It is used to purchase a particular product that is advertised using that kind of method. And speaking of purchasing a product, I still recommend you to get one of my courses, either the Philosophy of the Machine on the Philosophy of Technics, link is in the description, or sign up to be informed about when the course on the Philosophy of Power is open at Halcyon Guild. Once again, here's the QR code. Feel free to scan it and sign up. And like and subscribe if you want to support my work. I'm going to be publishing more frequently on Substack. Soon writing more about technology, the impact specifically of neurotechnology, of brain-computer interfaces, and brain-computer interfaces, and the philosophy of basically combining neuroscience and combining it with artificial intelligence. And this is particularly my field of study. So if you're interested, also sign up for my Substack if you want to financially support this show so I can do it more often, more professionally, and prepare more. Then sign up as a paid subscriber on Substack. Yes. So, getting back to the notion of the power that is evoked by archetypal activation, and the power that is exerted over you by archetypal activation. That happens, and that is exactly how power is exerted over the subject. I speak about it in my last episode on the stream about the subject and its double meaning. You know, the subject as opposed to the object, and the subject as being subject to power, and the notions of identity described by Foucault, for example, but also by Luhmann. And this is exactly how power is exerted in that sense. It is most strongly exerted if it is exerted upon the psyche, upon the unconscious of the subject. And yeah, so this can also be turned around. This can also, so what I'm getting at is the empowerment of the ego to resist this kind of external influence is the depth work to recognize when the unconscious is targeted, to recognize that it is being targeted, that it is being controlled by exterior forces. And as I said, as we've looked at this monster that can be hiding within this unconscious, this can be controlled, it can be tamed. The power of individuation, the entire task of individuation is taming that inner beast and taking control of it yourself, rather than having external factors basically reward and punish it, having external factors running it for you. And this is where personal power comes from. It is an insane energy, it is an intense energy that one does often not even know that one inhabits, but that energy can be unlocked by many different means. And once it is discovered, once the archetypal structure of one's own individuation, the archetypal structure meaning the deep meaning that is conveyed, for example, the deep meaning that is conveyed in big stories and grand narratives, the feeling you have when looking at a great epic, listening to a great myth, that is something that is very real. It resonates with archetypes, with archetypal energies. And these archetypal energies can be evoked not only through looking at entertainment stories, but also evoked in real life, in the real discovery of meaning within the world. And that is where these energies can lead to greater liberation. It can lead to a fundamental restructuring of the psyche. You cannot destroy or create elements in the psyche, but you can fully transform the elements within the psyche. Yeah. And also, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. I will address them always at the end of the streams. I'm just kind of getting into it, still trying to figure stuff out. So if you also have any suggestions on what I should talk about, any suggestions about what could be improved, what is kind of irritating, if there's an annoying sound that I've never noticed in my setup, let me know. And yeah, remember, subscribe and support my work. All the links are in the description. So just let me check some of your comments. From It's Me, your work is fascinating because you combine philosophy, psychology, and politics. Thank you very much. New to your channel, glad I discovered it. Thank you. Thank you very much. I do appreciate the praise. I do appreciate some positive feedback. I do like to know whether I'm on the right path. Yeah. Am I seeing it correctly? It's Me. Is that a Palestine flag in your profile picture? I did actually play with the thought of using the conflict as a particular example to analyze political power and global power. Though I do like keeping, even though I speak about politics to some extent, I speak about it in a very philosophical and abstract way. So I sometimes think I'm kind of hesitant in a sense that I don't want to necessarily jump into a very controversial, crossfiery situation. But I've done a video on my channel with Robert Morris, who is a kind of a geopolitics guy. I don't know if you know him, but I may be speaking to him next month again, and perhaps we'll be touching upon some of these topics. Yeah. All right. So, if there is no more questions, then I thank you for your attention, and let me know what you thought of this session. Let me know if there's anything else I should talk about. I'm kind of going through, I'm using these live streams to reflect upon all the reading I've done, especially surrounding the topic of power, but many other topics I've read about kind of tie into it. So I may also get more into science, theory of science, foundations, and also to some extent a critique of science that I've done specifically in my last course on philosophy of techniques. And stay tuned for anything new. I'm going to keep this up regularly. It's going to be a regular show at least once a week. And I will see you next time. Thank you very much. Bye bye.